Coming up, the off-season rolls along, and as training camp and all the expectations start to build, we ask the question, what should the QB room accomplish, regardless of who's under center, plus undrafted free agents that can make a big impact for Big Blue? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, we are tech savvy. You wouldn't know about any problems on the back end, buddy. On a Monday, got a lot to get to here, including obscuring the person under center and just focusing in on stats for the QB for the Giants.
Adam, I'm excited. I'm pumped. Obviously, we went through the draft. The Giants used the undrafted free agent period to shore up a few things. We'll obviously talk about that a little bit. But man, this is where we start understanding what the roster looks like. There's going to be very little movement, in my opinion, from now till the start of the season. It feels like there will be complementary things that happen. So, Giant fans, this is what the team is going to primarily look like.
Yeah, there's a lot out there right now already saying about like what are the expectations QB class for the Giants, expect him to be contributing early and often. Obviously, we know Malik Neighbors, but you're looking into the backfield. Now we're talking about whether or not getting a late round running back now all of a sudden elevates expectations for what he'll be doing this season. We talk about Andrew Phillips on the cornerback side. Like all these guys are going to be there getting reps. And I think it was Bobby Skinner who put out 79-11, I believe, is the split right now. Joe Shane, Dave Gettleman players currently still on the New York Football Giants roster. And it's like, okay, the culling of the former regime is almost all the way done here. We know some of those key figures that still remain, the Darnay Holmes, the Darius Slaytons of the world. So we'll continue to talk about that because as the offseason unfolds, we'll see here and when we talk about free agents on the back end, whether or not there's something potentially down the pike here for Big Blue. But we start with the quarterback position because I said this over on social, so now I'm beholden to keep myself to this standard. I don't care about the Daniel Jones conversation anymore. As for, was he the right quarterback when he was drafted at 6th overall? Is he bad? Is he too injury prone? Was it a mistake to give him the contract? A lot of these answers are easy yeses, or maybe if you're a faithful Daniel Jones supporter, you want to push back on some of them. Great, grand, wonderful, whatever. What we now know is that it's Daniel Jones, it's Drew Lock, and it's Tommy DeVito. That is your QB room. And then you got a little Division III guy that's going to be pushing for a playing time here too. But I just thought it made more sense to say, what does this QB room need to accomplish this season to make it feel like you believe in Brian Daboll, you believe in Mike Kafka, and you believe in Joe Shane? They've put together or are putting together a solid roster. And so now it just comes down to, I don't care who's throwing the ball. This should be the baseline standard for what this team accomplishes in 2024.
Yeah, I think you're right, Adam. Keep in mind, Drew Lock is a year older than Daniel Jones. They're about the same age. We talk about the arm talent is there for Drew Lock. And
Sure.
to your point, for this exercise, it's not about who we think should win the job. It's not about comparing what skill set Daniel Jones has versus Drew Lock. It's, okay, let's say we pick one of them because presumably one of them will be the starting quarterback. What should the expectations be now that the offensive line has been changed? Now that you have Malik Neighbors, now that you went out and got Theo Johnson, now that Devin Singletary is there, Tyrone Tracy's there, the whole offense looks drastically different. And it feels like there's a few different key stats or indicators to me that would point to what is the level of play that we need from a quarterback just as a baseline. Like, what is the line of demarcation to say we don't need to go out and find another person, or this person is doing enough for us to win football games? And so, Adam, I didn't know if you had any thoughts off the top. There's a million stats from like, touchdown interception ratio, quarterback rating, passer rating, all that different stuff. I have a few key ones, but I wanted to hear from you if there's anything that you're looking for specifically.
No, and I think you said it right about competitiveness, right? Like that's what the expectation is here. What is the expectation of what the quarterback position needs to accomplish for the Giants to be competitive week over week, to have this team be in a position where we think, hey, added some nice weapons to the defensive side of the football, Brian Burns chief among them, right? We believe that this team can be competitive week over week if the QB helps the offense do X. And that's where I think all these stats come in handy because, as I'm sure, when we reflect back on stat, yards per game, whether it's touchdowns, interception ratio, all these things, we're going to end up looking and seeing, oh, wouldn't you know it? The teams that accomplished X offensively ended up being in the mix for a wild card spot, ended up being in the mix for playoff football potentially. And that's what you'd at least like the Giants to be sniffing around.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And when you talk about that, the first stat that I'm going to go to illustrate this is a very simplistic one, easy for everyone to understand, and it's passing yards per game, Adam. And like
Yes.
you may say, well, offenses are designed differently. Like maybe this scheme, focuses more on run blocking. Sure, in a vacuum, those things are true. However, they generally put the ball in the hands of the quarterbacks they trust more, who end up making plays. And the guys who are at the top of the passing yards per game are usually the ones that are in the playoffs. I mean, it's you could say correlation or causation. For me, it's the correlation of the quarterback's really good, so we put the ball in his hands more, he gets more passing yards. And so, Adam, here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to give you a number for passing
Okay.
yards per game, and and tell me how it feels. My number is basically 225 passing yards per game. Now, does that feel high? Does that feel low? Does that feel just right? What do you think, Goldilocks, on 225?
Yeah, which porridge is just warm enough for me? I think it's high. I think it's high for Daniel Jones and Drew Lock based on their career numbers. But I think that to me, even if you go by either one of them and look at their careers, 188 yards per game for Drew Lock, 208 for Daniel Jones. But I think it sets the expectation of now there's a number one wide receiver in this room, as we understand with Malik Neighbors. You still have other talent there, and you have an improved offensive line. I think that should be the baseline, and I'm sure. I wonder if I said that that's probably like 18th, 17th ish in the league. Is that probably too low though? It's probably a little bit higher than that.
No, it's actually like 23rd ish
Oh,
in
okay,
the
yeah,
league. But again, there are some outliers of guys that stepped in for one game and threw for 300 yards. And like,
well,
so
yeah,
when you're
yeah,
talking
yeah.
about starting quarterbacks, you're talking about that puts him in the it would get him out of the bottom third in terms of passing yards. And you may say, well, that's a really low bar, Andy. But when you actually look at the passing yards per game, I use that number 225 because Kyler Murray is sitting there at that like 20 something position, and he's at 224.9. He's basically at 225. And to me, he
That's a
feels
good,
like a
yeah.
really good barometer of like where a starting quarterback starts. And below him is kind of where you sit there and say, oh, there's a reason why they don't put the ball in these people's hands. So directly below Kyler Murray, you have Jake Browning, Russell Wilson, Aiden O'Connell, Will Levis, Justin Fields, Gardner Minshew, Mac Jones, right? So like that grouping is almost like spot on. You're like, if you squint long enough, you could like get a game out of those guys, but you wouldn't sit there and say, I want this guy to be my franchise quarterback, or we're getting enough where I don't have to worry about the position.
Yeah, 100%. And by the way, off the top of the dome there, guess what? 17th by team passing yards per game. That put you at 17th is 224.2 Tampa Bay Buccaneers a year ago. And they're right in that range with the Philadelphia Eagles at 225.5, the Bengals 229.1, 230 for the Seattle Seahawks, Chargers 232.8 as you go up the board moving towards the top. Whereas you would expect Miami Dolphins, Detroit Lions, Dallas Cowboys, 49ers, all these teams that are in the mix there. And obviously the balance between passing and rushing matters here. But there it is from a team perspective. That's going to be that number 225. Yeah, that puts you right in the middle of the pack here. And by the way, that demarcation line, if you think back to last season and who was playing quarterback for some of these teams and team results, just below that is going to be Washington, going to be Cleveland, who had problems with their QB spot, the Colts, who lost Richardson very early in the year, the Ravens, the Falcons, who were just an enigma of misery despite having all the offensive talent in the world, the Raiders, the Broncos. Like, so when you start to go into those other teams, even if they are more run heavy in some situations, you start to think about who played quarterback for them last year. How did that team finish last year? And you're like, yeah, if you're not going a little over 225, you're not looking at being a likely competitive team trying to make the wild card, trying to make the playoffs.
Yeah, and above Kyler Murray, you have all the guys that you would expect. Even Jalen Hurts is up there for as much as he's a dual threat guy. Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, etc. And then you get into the upper echelons of your Josh Allen's, Patrick Mahomes, Stafford, Dak Prescott, Brock Purdy, CJ Stroud, Tua, etc. Those feel like you're confident in their abilities. You want to put the ball in their hands to make plays. And so for me, I look at that and say, Daniel Jones needs to throw for 225 yards, or Drew Lock, or whoever the Giants quarterback is going to be. By that estimation, 225 yards. Let's say they miss one game. Give him a game just in case he sprains an ankle or gets a concussion or something. You're
Sure.
talking about throwing for 3,600 yards, literally on the dot. And like in
Mhm.
today's NFL with the weapons and now time, that feels like a reasonable expectation to be, as you mentioned, top half of the league type of passing offense. You said 17th is right around that 225 number. To me, that seems like the perfect indicator. If the Giants offense and the quarterback position gets them like the 16th best production, I think the Giants are competitive in more games than people think this year.
So 21st would be if you go by passing yards per game this past season. That's going to be the Baltimore Ravens line of demarcation, 36-35 inside of their offensive system. Yeah, then you have the Atlanta Falcons right behind them with 3,500, et cetera, on down the line. Again, total yardage matters here, but we're talking about that QB spot. So to your point, it's not like we're setting a gold standard here for the Giants quarterback position. 225-ish yards a game, 3,600 kind of yards for the year. It's going to make you somewhere. You're going to be a top 20-ish kind of team, probably in the middle third, right? You're not nowhere near the top third, but right in the meaty part of the curve. And I think if you go back to last year and look at those numbers, it really would inform your perspective, because here's one other funny thing I do want to get to here. We all know the Giants were bad last season. The Giants averaged 169.8 passing yards a game last year. What a mess, right? Dead last was the Carolina Panthers, 161.2. But just think about this all the way up to, so starting with the Denver Broncos and going down. Denver Broncos had 191.9 yards passing per game. Denver Broncos, new quarterback. Pittsburgh Steelers, new quarterback. Cardinals, injuries. Kyler Murray comes back later in the season, so you understand that. Chicago Bears, new quarterback. Patriots, new quarterback. Titans moved on from their veteran quarterback. Jets didn't have their quarterback. Giants kept their quarterback, had injuries, obviously, as well. It is a factor. And then the Panthers. Every one of the in that bottom 10 team moved on from their quarterback, because they associated the lack of production at that position with the QB plan and was like, that's it, man. We cannot go forward with this. Most of those teams, even a lot of them, are bad teams, didn't make the playoffs, and still made that choice. It's just a little caveat about how the New York Football Giants, in spite of being in that position, have still come back to the same agenda and said, we're going to go one more time with this, trying to fix the things around them, as you and I have talked about. Fix everything around the quarterback spot and be ready to drop a new quarterback in if necessary. Let's extend this conversation around the QB position before we get into undrafted free agents, around what other key stats does Andy have up his sleeve here that tell us the Giants can be successful if they hit these benchmarks. We'll get into that in just one moment. Reminder here as we continue today's Locked On Not. Whoops, wow. Here we go. I'm on the Nets. It's fine. Reminders, we continue today's One Giant podcast episode that we're brought to you by Potential. That's Pietential. Potential is an online, free for individual users assessment tool that sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to progress over time, and also tracks that progress to make sure that you're improving in the key areas that you want to. You've been drafted. You have high expectations. Get over, set that wellness baseline, and make sure that some of those rookie ups and downs do not give you stumbling blocks along the way. Potential.com. Check it out today. Okay, Andy, yards per game. Great. Simple benchmark, be in the meaty part of the curve. That's our one expectation. What's the next key stat that you believe is critical for this QB position?
Yeah, so I think you go to total QBR, especially given Daniel Jones's ability, Daniel Jones or the quarterback's ability to run and pass. I think passer rating is nice, and you'll see, like, I think there's more of a correlation in QBR than there is other places. And we're not talking about the Giants quarterback being top 5 in any of these positions this year. That's when you get into the elite of the elite, the franchise guys, the guys you expect to be in conference finals and conference championships regularly. When you think about a QBR number, just what would the number have to look like? To me, it feels like the line of demarcation here is 51. 51 puts you as the 20th best QBR in the league, which happened to be Joe Burrow last year at 51.6. Now we know Joe Burrow was quite injured, had an up and down season, so it wasn't a great season in terms of Joe Burrow standards. But even in a bad year, Joe Burrow was still above some of the other guys that you would think about. And Adam, just below that, you're talking about Kyler Murray, who was injured, Justin Fields, who got traded, Sam Howell, who got traded, Aiden O'Connell, who might not start, Desmond Ridder, who got traded, Kenny Pickett, who got traded, Mac Jones, who got traded, Bryce Young is a rookie, and Zach Wilson, who got traded. So the line of demarcation underneath there is basically anyone below Joe Burrow has either lost their job or has been traded since then. And so to me, like, that benchmark is not very high. When you move up above it, you're talking about Baker Mayfield, Trevor Lawrence, Derek Carr. CJ Smith, CJ Stroud, etc., Geno Smith. Like, to me, we're talking about what the expectations are, knowing that we may not have the franchise quarterback, however it shakes out. But just a reasonable suggestion is to say, can you be in the top 20 in QBR? That seems like a good indicator, because if you're not, you're shipped out or traded, most likely, given what happened in the previous year.
Well, and to your point, not shipped out or traded 100%, but also again, we're talking about offensive success. Well, there's no way that if you're not getting a top 20 QBR, which accounts for situational football, right? Not making bad turnovers in key spots, red zone stats, getting conversions on third downs, all of those things. If the quarterback position is not playing at a top 20 level, there's just this, it's a pretty easy one-to-one correlation. Well, how are we going to have maybe Malik Neighbors, who has a bet about being the rookie of the year with his former quarterback at LSU, right? He's talking about Jaden Daniels. We got 10,000 cash riding on rookie of the year. Well, you're not going to win that one if you don't have Drew Lock, Daniel Jones, whoever being able to get the ball into your hands. And there's no way they're doing that successfully more often than not if the QBR is slipping down there somewhere into that lower third kind of range. The interesting thing I'll say for me on QBR is, because you mentioned those names there, it's just funny. Like, Baker Mayfield, I think, is an interesting one, right? Former high pick, doesn't really work out in his first stop, but ends up navigating his way ultimately to Tampa Bay and has a really good year, 54.3. Because you mentioned guys like Dobbs, Burrow, we're going to say outlier injuries, everything else like you mentioned. But Russell Wilson back end in his career, Kyler Murray coming back, getting in the flow. When you mentioned guys like Justin Fields at 46.1, Sam Howell, 42.4, Aiden O'Connell, 40.5, Desmond Ridder, 40.1. These guys aren't supposed to be potential franchise players. And even if we don't think that Daniel Jones or Drew Lock is, that idea of being serviceable. So I agree with you. That's the right demarcation. But I'll also add in, like you mentioned, Geno Smith. Well, Geno Smith was capable of giving you a 59.5, 59.6 for Gardner Minshew when he played. Jalen Hurts, as you mentioned, 60.1. So I'm not going to go all up to Jalen Hurts because he is a franchise guy. Derek Carr, 56.5, 56.1 for Trevor Lawrence. Like, there's something there. And if we're just talking about creating this window, hey, be there, man. Be 21st in QBR. But if you give a good year, if the QB spot outperforms expectations a little bit, all of a sudden you think about maybe not even this past season, the year prior with Geno Smith, right? When he really hit the mark for Seattle and they surprised some teams around the league. That's, I think, the part of this that you want to see too. And a lot of that comes down to play clean football, mistake-free football, and hit some of those big throws in those big moments.
So, Adam, it's you're spot on with that. And what's fascinating is you just look at Daniel Jones's QBRs, because let's just say he ends up being the guy that's there.
Yeah, by the way, it's high level. We assume that, yes, he's going to have every opportunity to be the starting quarterback. We want to make this a global discussion here.
Yes. So Daniel Jones, just because I want to be able to illustrate the QBR and why it's so important. Year one, he had a 55 where you're like, man, he could throw the ball a little bit. We just got to cut down on the fumbles and the turnovers. Like, maybe we have something. The next year, 54. So he regressed a little bit. But you're like, he could win a couple games. His completion percentage went up. Like, didn't have as good of a year. Year three, he struggles and has a 47.5, trending in the wrong direction. Joe Shane gets hired. The Giants decline his fifth-year option and say, we're just going to play this one out. He's been declining. Things are not working out. Adam, he comes back in the playoff season where they win the playoff game in Minnesota. He has a 62.9 QBR. Last year, that would have put him 8th, just in front of Patrick Mahomes, Jordan Love, and Tua Tagovailoa. So, that's why it's so important to be able to have that play across the entire field. And Adam, he backs that up last season. Obviously, only played in 6 games, hurt the knee, was injured. Whatever excuses you want to make, neither here nor there. 36.3 would have made him one of the worst. It would have put him in the bottom 3 in terms of the worst QBR play. So from 2022, he went from a top 10 quarterback play using his legs and throwing the ball,
That's right,
winning a playoff game. That all makes sense. You're like, sure, if you're getting into the top 10, you should be winning a playoff game. And then the ugly side just rears its ugly head. And it's why the quarterback position is so polarizing for the Giants, because it's like top 10 quarterback play, but people don't know if it's real or not. And then it's like bottom 3 quarterback play. Like, this is more regression to the mean with injuries. It is just a nightmare trying to figure out what the expectations are. That's why it's so hard. To me, the height is like, you can play maybe fringe top 10 in certain games using your legs. But the bottom, Adam, the bottom is just not good enough. And that's the problem with Daniel Jones, is that when the bottom falls out, he's literally one of the worst quarterbacks in the entire NFL.
100%. Right. And we understand the caveats of this thing, whether it's for whether it's for Daniel Jones or any position, right? Whether it's for what was the ceiling that could have been for Darius Slayton. Saquon Barkley was always the great example, right? Well, if he had only had a good offensive line year over year, what will we have seen from him? Oh, remember rookie season, or remember when he first came back from the injury, right? You always go back and look at those things and imagine how it could have been better. But like with Saquon Barkley, like, yeah, but he's at least always really good, right? We know that what the floor is for him. Daniel Jones is giving you this window where it says, and Drew Lock, smaller sample size, right? Showing some good, showing some bad. But it's like the pendulum of which this can swing on is very significant. And I'll go back again to a name that I mentioned before in Geno Smith. Why? Because even though he only played in 4 games in 2021, his QBRs over the last 3 seasons have been 51.8, 62.8, 59.5. Now, that's going to probably get you into, as you mentioned, hey, up into the top 10 conversation. He was there in 2022, slides a little bit out of that in 2023. And I remember going back to 22, we said Patrick Mahomes, like some of those QBRs all came down a little bit. Like the QB class across the board struggled a little. And that got Daniel Jones maybe at 8 as opposed to being settled in at 11 or 12 in most years. But the point being, that's 3 seasons back to back to back of consistent play. Is it going to be top 10 every year? Maybe not, but it's always going to be in the pocket. It's always going to be in that kind of range where you can say if everything's right around him, he can have success, the team can have success. And frankly, when it comes to Geno Smith, going all the way back, the first 3 years in the league when he was drafted by the Jets, 41, 45.8, 56.9. And then it kind of goes off the rails in that final year. He only plays 2 games. He gets injured, ends up on the Giants, wouldn't you know it, where he had a 39.8 QBR. But you see that it really in totality, outside of injuries and bouncing around, Geno Smith is kind of that kind of guy, right? Like, hey, I can give you a 50-plus QBR year over year with consistency. And that's the biggest question mark for this QB room, Drew Lock included. Week over week, 4 games, 6 games, 8 games, 12 games, 17 games. Can you give that consistent performance so that you know every other skill position around you can succeed and have success game over game?
I couldn't agree more. That's
Thank you.
the issue that the Giants need to solve right now is can you throw for 225 yards to make sure to keep the defense honest? Can you at least play reasonably well in terms of a QBR? We know that we've seen when successful, the Giants can win a playoff game with this quarterback room. But we've also seen the negative, which is the bottom fell out last year. It just wasn't good. And the Giants have made changes. This is a completely different team, different roster. It's not going to be focusing on Saquon Barkley the same way. We have higher expectations for the quarterback room, knowing that we don't have an explosive weapon that you hand the ball to 30 times in the backfield. The team will need to be better overall, especially along the offensive line, but definitely at the quarterback position.
Coming up, I'll ask Andy if he has anything else he wants to mention about the QB position, but then we do want to make sure we add in because it's the off season and the Giants did not address every position we thought they might in the draft. Undrafted free agents, where the Giants really went to town, across the offensive line, in the secondary, and even on that defensive front. We'll dive into that conversation coming up here in just one moment. All right, Andy, there's a couple of key names we do want to get to here that the Giants brought in. We obviously thought offensive line could be a target, but ironically, I thought about it too late. Watch where the Giants spent money in free agency. As Andy always says, follow the money. And because they did spend money on the offensive line, I should have known they weren't going to address offensive line potentially early or maybe at all in the draft. Couple of key names here to look at, but feel free if you want to say anything else about the QB spot before we move on.
Nope. QB done and dusted. I think we'll have all
Thank you.
offseason to talk about training camp battles and all
Oh,
that fun
baby, will
stuff.
we ever?
I want to get into the nitty gritty and what everyone cares about the undrafted free agents, the guys that did not get drafted that end up making, signing with the Giants to either compete for a practice squad spot, maybe make the back end of the roster, or just, battle it out and make players better in camp throughout the entire time. And
Yes,
I
sir.
am one of those guys that says follow the money. It's just something I believe. And when the Giants end up putting dollars behind the words that Joe Shane says, it means something to me. And so when you look at it, Dan Duggan gave a brief overview of the type of money that was given out. Offensive tackle from Missouri, Marcellus Johnson, got
Mhm.
$170,000 guaranteed. Pretty hefty signing, indicating that the Giants really wanted him and there was competition. And one that I thought was interesting was North Dakota State tackle Jake Kubis. He got $270,000 in guaranteed money. Adam, the reason why this is important, Dan Duggan goes on to say, Colorado State cornerback who signed with Washington was the only one that he heard got more money, which was 350,000, which is a crazy number for an undrafted free agent. The reason why that 270,000 for Jake Kubis is an interesting one is because typically practice squad guys make about $225,000 in money over the course of the year. So what the Giants have said to Jake Kubis, essentially by giving him this money, is you have solidified a spot on our practice squad. We think you're a developmental guy. We're going to incentivize you even further by giving you more money. We're going to give you a $30,000 signing bonus. We're going to give you $240,000. We think that there's an opportunity for you to push Yanni Kajusti and others for that last swing tackle position on the roster. That's a big indicator that the Giants think that Jacobus could make the roster coming out of camp. But if not, the Giants have a very competitive guy that they can develop at a position that they clearly need some help in, especially if some of these other draft picks from last few years don't pan out.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what it indicates to me. You mentioned there that money and always lets you know what you think the expectations could be, at least to be making the practice squad, at least to be a part of the future of this team, developing guys in the background. We know the Giants brought in Runyon. We know they brought in Illuminor. We know they brought in Stinney. But the other part of it is the Marcus McCathins, right? And whether or not we think that they are going to develop, the Joshua Zudus, and whether or not we think they are going to develop. And I think if you're Joe Shane and the Giants, you kind of look at it as, well, if those guys miss, we're going to a little bit of egg on our face that we spent mid-round picks on these guys. And if we want to try to fix it, you see what we did. We went out in free agency. We brought in guys that have a consistency, that have an expectation set around them. We're going to make the line good now. And because we're going to safeguard against the fact that some of our other players aren't going to develop right. And then in the background here, if one of these guys comes up, then we know about contracts coming up, right? Rookie deals are going to expire here. So I really think we're going to have an interesting time in camp here, potentially looking and saying, oh, yeah. First couple of seasons here for Joe Shane in the draft, took some shots on guys. They didn't pan out. And you've gone ahead and decided to fix this thing on the free agent market. And then hopefully with a new offensive line coach in place now too, let's develop our talent and have some guys that can bridge the gaps when we need to.
Joshua Miles, Jalen Mayfield, these are all names that are going to be in camp competing for one of those depth pieces. A guy like Kubis or Johnson can absolutely win one of those roles. They're being paid to basically say, if nothing else, you're going to be on our practice squad pushing these players to get better. Adam, it's important to note the Giants were the only team in the NFL draft that did not draft an offensive or defensive lineman. The Giants,
who needs,
pride themselves on having someone like Dexter Lawrence and others, but also like they needed to address it after post draft. They could not just sit there and say, well, we're good with a John Runyon Jr. signing or an Illuminor signing. They have to make the entire roster better. I think it's go time for those names that you mentioned, and McCathan and Azudu and everyone else. Like, if it's not this year and you're not showing progress, we have to find some other developmental talent that maybe we could scratch the surface on and get a rotational piece out of.
Flipping it over to the defensive side of the football here for the Giants, couple of things. So obviously you mentioned about the money. Take a look at a guy, and you're going to talk about defensive line here in a second, but Alex Johnson, he gets brought in. You go over to NFL.com as far as the prospect grade, a 5.68 grade, candidate for bottom of the roster or practice squad. But again, like you're touching on the fringe of being maybe a special teams contributor, depth chart guy, 6 foot, $185. When you go out and bring him in, listen, more than anything to me, what I look at is, and they just signed, I talked about this at the end of last week, you signed David Long Jr. Does not impress me, does not excite me, and I don't know what their expectations are there. But when you look in this secondary, again, we like the signing of, who looks like now, by the way, Drew Phillips. Get rid of the "and." It's just Drew Phillips. Sounds a little more bullish coming to the NFL. Trey Hawkins, late round pick, flashed early, fizzled late. Dane Belton, question marks there. They brought in Jalen Mills in the secondary. You have all these names. Your Aaron Robinson, injury concerns. Is he going to be able to play? Cordell Flott, is he going to progress, or is he going to go the other way? I think that they're still trying to figure out someone that can come in and just maybe be someone that pushes, again, back end of the roster. Darnay Holmes comes to mind here, right? He carved out a special teams role for himself. I don't know if Alex Johnson is going to be the guy that is the surprise out of camp. But I just like the idea, especially as indicated by his draft profile, offers the value as a potential 4-phase special teamer. So boom, there you go. You want to see a guy that potentially is going to make the roster, not as someone contributing in the secondary, but just on this team. That's what I think the Giants also looked at and tried to accomplish after the draft concluded. Hey, We want to improve our special teams unit and maybe have developmental guys. So he's a player that I'm going to keep my eye on here as we work into camp.
Yeah, it feels like the cornerback position still a question mark for me. I'm sure the Giants feel the same way.
Flexible,
A lot of fans do.
fluid.
It feels like Joe Shane went to the corner store or the deli or the bodega and bought quite a few scratch off tickets, Adam, and he's hoping that one of those maybe can hit for a couple bucks to be able to cover the cost. Because right now you look at it and say, Deontay Banks will guard AJ Brown. Who's guarding Devonta Smith? Who's taking
Yeah.
on that one-on-one challenge on the outside against just one of the teams in our division? And so the Giants are still looking at that. We're going to talk about the free agent target in a second. I think there's a name that you and I probably both like that the Giants could look at. But to this point, I think he's bringing a lot of bodies in. Competition is going to be fierce in camp. Cordell Flat will get the first crack on the outside, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see if one of these guys tries to emerge. But as we know in training camp, look no further than last year with Trey Hawkins to know these guys need a little bit of seasoning before we could just say, yep, lock that undrafted free agent or late round pick into the cornerback 2 spot and go up against Pro Bowl caliber wide receivers.
100%. We're going to talk about a guy like Nick McLeod too. This camp's going to be really fascinating for the secondary specifically, and all these bodies, who's going to come out to the top there, and what do the Giants need to maybe add. But the other thing that I brought up going into the draft was, hey, don't be surprised if the Giants look to add a defensive tackle, because they lost Leonard Williams, right? They also lost Robinson, leaving Ashawn this past season as well. They have some young guys that they drafted last year, but you want to bolster this thing, make a strength even stronger, Andy. They didn't do it until after the draft, where they did go get a player that you had your eye on and think could potentially be someone that's at the back end of this roster, depth piece, and could maybe easily find his way onto a roster spot.
Yeah, I think Casey Rogers is an interesting one, the defensive tackle out of Oregon. Obviously, we just mentioned before they did not address the defensive line in the draft or free agency, pretty much for that matter.
Yeah.
And we forget that Leonard Williams was traded. Ashawn Robinson left in free agency. While we feel confident that Dexter Lawrence is a top end type of talent for us on the defensive front, we still need depth. We still need stability. We have Nunez Roche, who's still there for the time being. Casey Rogers is a fascinating one. Right now, 33rd team, who does a great job breaking down draft prospects, has him the 333rd ranked overall player, but his position grade was a 5.8, which is considered a backup in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
What I find interesting, Casey Rogers has been in college for forever. This is the era where during the pandemic you have guys that have been there for 6 years. He spent his first 4 years at Nebraska, went over to Oregon and played there for a couple of years. What I like about Casey Rogers is his just pure athleticism. He needs refinement. He needs technique. That is undisputed with Casey Rogers. However, as 33rd team says, he has a high motor. He has all this athleticism and energy. And his relative athletic score, his RAS score, Adam, 9.80 out of a possible 10. It ranked 34th out of 1,668 defensive tackles since 1987. So he's in the top 50 of the thousands of defensive tackles in terms of athleticism. This is the perfect type of guy that you bring in as an undrafted free agent. Has all the athleticism and talent. Now we got to coach him up with no more classes and schoolwork and all that different stuff that goes on. The defensive line coach gets to step in and say, I'm going to teach you how to become a professional. This is exactly the developmental guy that you want to take a swing at in free agency to be able to back up someone like Dexter Lawrence.
You better believe it. Let's do this in a form or fashion that we think makes sense, because boy, we run long. Why? Because Andy wasn't here last week, so you always got to play a little bit of catch up with your co-host. There's a lot of narratives to build up on here. Let's just tease. What do we think is going to be a key free agent that we'll discuss more in depth? But a name out there for you. I talked about a couple players defensively last week, but what's a name that you're keeping your eye on here? Here's the premise, boys. Obviously, Darren Waller retires. That seems to be where we're trending here. We're all excited about Theo Johnson. They get a little more money to work with. Who does Joe Shane have his eye on?
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I both would agree that the cornerback spot is something that the Giants still have to figure out. There's a lot of bodies that are there that, as I mentioned, we're hoping that one of them ends up being a lotto ticket. But I think you've mentioned the name before. I think we'll talk about it. There are some high-end guys out there that still are expecting to see maybe $10 million a year. I don't see the Giants participating in any of that right now, even though there's no draft compensation attached to these guys. But when you talk about that mid, $3, $4, $5 million to be able to shore it up, You mentioned the name Ahkello Weatherspoon before from the Rams. I think that's an interesting one for the Giants. We don't have to go into it in depth. Maybe we will at a
Mhm.
later date prioritize and rank some of these cornerbacks. But Adam, the Giants still feel like they have a hole and they need to figure out whether or not Darren Waller's money allows them to reallocate that spend elsewhere now that Theo Johnson is in the building.
Yeah, honestly, I'm not going to bring anybody else up because that's the name for me. It's the one I thought when they signed David Long. I said, "Oh, prove me right and go sign Witherspoon." They didn't do. Fine, but go ahead and you can still go do it because signing David Long to what I'm assuming is probably a real low cost, contract is not precluding you from going and doing it again here and bringing another body in. I think again, for me, this becomes about reshaping that secondary. There are a lot of names in that room that you could very easily see who got big reps last year, got consistent depth reps last year that aren't going to see the field at all, especially if you're someone coming into the last year of a contract. Special teams value matters here, contributing behind Deonte Banks, across from Deonte Banks, around Cordell Flott, around a young player in Drew Phillips. All these things really matter here for this secondary. So let's keep an eye on those guys and let's dive into them a little bit deeper. Rookies will report at the end of the upcoming week here. So Thursday into Friday, we'll have some news about them as well. How do they look in camp and what are they saying about their beginning journey with the NFL and the New York Football Giants? Until next time, though, on what was a hearty. This is like wintertime stew when you're cold in blustery doors. Instead, strip down to your Speedos, boys and girls, because we're getting you hearty. You're going to want to stay fit for the summer. I don't know what that meant, but the bottom line is get over to YouTube. One Giant Podcast. Follow, turn the alerts so you know when we're going live, baby. Get over on X, AMAC214, at Adam Armbrecht, and at One Giant Podcast. And on those podcast feeds, wherever you get those needs fulfilled. Until next time, until the best times, as Andrew Mack was want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.